virtual gallery talk. I'm not sure that's an expression I've ever used before. We're really glad you're here. We hope you had time to view the ebook we sent you if you registered in advance. We will have an electronic catalog we'll be sending out again after the talk, so be sure to check it out. I think it's a pretty nice document. We're going to have a talk, and then we're going to have questions and answers, so please be thinking of some good questions as we go on. In 2002, I moved to the Bay Area and went to work for Rene DeRosa, where I helped open his 250-acre sculpture garden and fabulous collection of Northern California art in the Napa Valley. Early on, Rene took me to Oakland to visit Viola Frey in her studio. I was so fortunate to see Viola at work and hear her talk with Rene about the good old days when Rene was figuring out how to grow grapes in the Carnwath region, and Viola was making all the Bay Area ceramic masters jealous of the scale of her figurative sculpture. Turns out size does matter. It was also at that time that I got to know Squeak Carnwath and her work. Rene had collected her at some depth, and her work was one of the highlights of a great collection. When I moved back to DC in 2005 to open the American University Museum in Washington, DC, I served a regular diet of San Francisco Bay Area artists to our Chesapeake Bay area. In 2014, we presented a major show of Squeak's work. And now the Artist Legacy Foundation, with Squeak, Viola, and Gary Neck co-founded, is bringing to us Gods and Monsters, artwork by Viola Frey. And Squeak will lead this discussion. She received numerous awards, including the Society for the Encouragement of Contemporary Art Award from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, 2 individual artist fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an award for individual artists from the Flint Ridge Foundation and the Lee Krasner Lifetime Achievement Award. Carnwath is a professor emerita at the University of California, Berkeley. Please welcome Squeak Carnwath.
Okay. Hi. I'm here as a representative for the Artist Legacy Foundation. I wanted to put, we were talking about years ago, I was interested in getting people to know the breadth of Viola's work and all the different ways in which she works. She does drawings, she does paintings, she does small things, big things. And so I wanted to, for the foundation, to put together something that would educate people about the different kinds of work that she does. And so in a meeting that the Artist Legacy, I'll tell you about the Artist Legacy Foundation in a minute, but in a meeting that the art committee had in the Artist Legacy Foundation, talking about strategies for Viola's work, I mentioned that I could think of a bunch of different themes to curate her show around, and that we could maybe talk to people about that. And so since we didn't have anybody to talk to about it, they said, why don't you put together something? And so I started out with this idea of doing monster pictures or monster works that were sort of more scary and not as friendly as the tall, colorful figures. And I contacted Mark Van Proyen because he's wrote one of the best essays that I've ever read, or one of the best reviews of her work that I ever saw or read of Viola's work, because it talked about it wasn't descriptive, it was more psychological, and talked about the meanings that were behind a lot of her figures and stuff, or that he read into them. And I thought that that was a way to look at her work. So he came over and we both looked at a lot of images and he figured out the title Gods and Monsters, which is perfect. And so that's where we are today. And the show was going to be beautiful, and it was going to be in the American University Museum. And now it's sitting in a warehouse someplace because COVID has changed everything. And so we're doing this. And what the Artist Legacy Foundation is it's a foundation for the care and stewardship of artists' works, and a development of their legacy. And Viola and I used to talk about leaving our work to CCAC, the art college that we both went to, and where I went to school and where I met Viola in 1968. And then we realized that wasn't really a good idea because they aren't a collecting institution, and even if they wanted to sell stuff, they don't know how to do that really. So we dropped that idea. And at one point, I said to somebody, I'd like to start a foundation, and everybody said to me, well, you have to have millions of dollars. And actually, you probably do have to, but we don't. So I told a lawyer that I know this, and he said, "Oh no, you can trade a painting, and we'll set up a foundation for you." And I said, "And I want to be able to give money to artists," and that makes it more complicated because a lot of foundations are more educational and they use other ways of getting money into the hands of artists. But I wanted it to be direct. So anyhow, so once it was all written up, I went and I told Viola that this was going to happen, and Gary and I were sending it into the IRS, and it was going to be the Carnwath Connect Foundation or something like that. And Viola just said, well, can I be a part of that? And for some reason I thought, oh wow, what a great idea. It can take lots of artists. We can call it the Artist Legacy Foundation, and it can pool resources, and it'll be much better than just one artist or two artists, or we don't have to have a named foundation, name of the Artist Foundation. It can be something more generous. So that's how it started. And I forget how many years in we are. We're probably close to 18 now. And we have two great directors who are working very hard to get Viola's work known and talked about and written about. And I think that's it. One thing I would like to say to all the artists out there is that everybody's work counts and everybody's work matters, and that the work that all artists, it's a privilege to be an artist, and all the work that we're doing is in a way, or is exactly a visual cultural history of America, and or where we live and how we live, and it needs to be preserved. And so what we're doing is really important, and we all need to figure out what happens to our work after we die. So it starts out by having a will, and then you go from there. And all of you should be thinking about that. And people do not need to be famous to figure this stuff out. Somebody once said to me, oh, you have to be famous to do that. No, you just have to realize you have to care about it. You have to take care of your work. Nobody else is going to take care of it for you. And you can figure out in your lifetime what you want to have happen to it. So it's a drag to think of because it's more fun to be in the studio and just make more shit. But we can't really do that all the time. So I think I'm done there. Now we go into the next person. Oh, there's Mark. Okay, so here's Mark, who was the co-curator, Mark Van Proyen. Oh, Cynthia. I'm introducing you to Cynthia. We're, at least we don't have dogs walking across the screen. That may happen later, but in any case, Cynthia DeBoss is going to introduce Mark, and Cynthia is our director of collections and archivist, and she works with Julia Schwartz, who is the director of outreach and all things managerial and tech, and she will now introduce Mark.
Thank you, Squeak.
Mm-hmm.
I want to informally introduce Mark Van Proyen onto the set. He was the author of the essay that delves into a very unique perspective of Viola Frey, one that's never been explored before. And what was your title before you retired, Mark? Can you hear me? Mark recently retired from the San Francisco Art Institute, I think days ago, so he's newly celebrating retirement. And it seems that we're having a little problem with audio. So I'll go ahead and start off. Mark had approached Squeak, or Squeak had approached Mark to talk about the Gods and Monsters idea, and Squeak presented Mark with a variety of images from the 70s to the early 80s, exploring these areas that hadn't been seen before, areas that galleries hadn't exhibited, artworks that had really been left on the studio shelf. And as Mark found out, he was exploring through the Viola Frey archives here at the foundation and getting a sense of what kinds of things Viola was trying to explore during the 70s into the early 80s before her well-known standing figures. And if you haven't had a moment to look at the Gods and Monsters catalog, it is available for download, and you can go to the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen and click on the link. It's available on the American University Museum website, along with some information about the exhibition. And it starts with an introduction of Viola Frey growing up on a farm in Lodi, which is a touchstone for most essays. She grew up in a place that didn't have art. She grew up on a farm that grew grapes. She had access to the library, and that was about it. And she didn't really take formal art classes until she was in a community college, Stockton Community College, and she was doing some painting, did a little bit of clay, but she really thought she'd be a teacher. And so she applied for a transfer to UC Berkeley, decided she didn't want to teach and study writing at Berkeley, and instead enrolled at California College of the Arts and Crafts in 1956, I believe, 55, 56. So she enrolled in painting as her medium because she cited that if you want to be an artist and taken seriously, and particularly as a woman, you needed to be a painter, not a crafts person, because in the 50s, clay was considered a craft. You did cups, you did plates, you did vases. So she studied painting under Richard Diebenkorn during his short period there, and learned about form and volume and how to stretch canvases. But she kept wandering back into the ceramics department, where Charles Fisk and Vernon Kuykendall were teaching, Art Nelson and others. And she cites in an interview from 1995 that clay was really a communal activity for her, and she really liked the people that were working with clay. She liked the people that were hanging out near the kilns, throwing pots, goofing around. She liked the colorfulness of the people and the community, and it was such a different contrast from the painters and the kind of elitist or sophisticated clubby setting that painting was at the time. And she really, even from her student years, she really attempted to marriage the fine art of painting in the medium of clay, because she could do whatever she wanted with clay. We learn, posthumously that she went gigantic in her sculptures, and she really helped crack the barrier between craft and fine art, and moved it from throwing pots on a wheel and production pottery and doing the same thing over and over again, to taking it into a sculptural medium and doing these very artistic creations. And even though she was dabbling in clay, she continued her studies at Tulane University and decided to take an MFA at, well, she didn't finish her MFA. She was one course short of the MFA. She studied at Tulane University, and while she was there, she took a class by Mark Rothko, which helped her learn and explore the idea of color and what it means to use red or yellow or blue or any of the colors. And you really see that use of color come forth in her ceramics from the 70s forward. And while she was at Tulane, she met Catherine Choi, who was she was a ceramics instructor at Tulane who had received a degree from Mills, taught at Cranbrook, and moved on to Tulane. Her and Viola hit it off because they were women. They wanted to use clay as a medium beyond production pottery. And Viola said, I want to work with you at Clay Art Center in Port Chester, New York. And so Viola left 1 year or one class shy of a MFA degree, joined Catherine at Port Chester, New York to study clay as a sculptural medium. And as I was reviewing Viola Frey's 1995 interview, she said that most of the people at Clay Art Center in its early beginnings in the late 50s were all transplants from the West Coast, which I thought was interesting because they were in New York. They were a train ride away from New York City. And why would they choose New York to do this innovative exploration in clay? So I think that remains to be seen. Clay Art Center is still around if you want to look up their website. They're doing great programming and they still have studios and they carry on Catherine Choi's legacy. But Viola was there for a couple of years before she headed back to the Bay Area, which is where Mark comes in. I'm hoping he can hear us. Can you hear us, Mark?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. I'm just talking a little bit of the background of Viola Frey. We're just leaving Port Chester, New York, and heading back to the Bay Area. And one of the questions that I was posing was why Viola and all of these people who had come in from other places, they were not East Coasters. Many of them were from the West Coast, and they went to Port Chester, New York to have this Clay Art Center in a place that was not hospitable to ceramics.
Interesting question. I guess the one way to go at it is to look at what Peter Volkos had done in the earliest part of his career when he was still in Southern California, teaching at the Otis Art Institute and generating a very energetic following for ceramic, non-functional ceramic work there. And then there's other Southern California ceramic sculptors like Kenny Price that followed suit. But Port Chester, well, I think that's a good question. It was close enough to Manhattan so that you could zip in and out of town relatively easily. It was probably not too expensive to live there. The winters probably made you wish that it was, or someplace else.
I wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, it's like, you're right out there next to the water, in 35 miles out on Long Island, or not on Long Island, but across from Long Island. So it probably was just, my best guess would be that ceramics artists were interested in each other. Certainly Fisk and Kuykendall were in communicate with a lot of other artists. So I think they just, opportunity somehow found itself in Port Chester. And that's where they all ended up, in large part because of Catherine Choi's family money being used to open and run the center.
I think one of the other things that you kind of touch on in the essay is that and I think you can say that New York was where you went in the United States in the 50s and 60s to make a reputation. I mean, it could be argued either way, but it was there Viola really got to see some of the heavy hitters, so to speak, like Picasso's 75th year retrospective and others that made an impression on her. And would you talk about having an impression or having an influence in Viola Frey? Can you talk about some of the things that Viola might have seen during her time in New York City?
Well, as working in the business office of the Museum of Modern Art, I imagine that she would find time either on a lunch break or some other kind of break to wander through the galleries. Certainly, the works that stand out in relationship to her work would be Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon and The Girl Before a Mirror, which I think both kind of morphologically and color-wise, and also in the way that the figures are handled, are similar to the way that Viola subsequently started handling the figure in her work much later. And then I bring up in the essay, and I go to some details, some examination of the painters that were shown in an exhibition curated by Peter Seltz called New Images of Man, which was held in 1959. Oddly enough, right after the point where Catherine Choi passed away, but right before the point that Viola left New York. And that exhibition was full of figurative paintings that were rich with anguish and existential dread. It was really the first generation of neo-expressionism, the second one happening in the late 1970s. And I think, and Richard Diemenkorn was in that exhibition, so he being one of Viola's former teachers, he would have, she would have certainly made an effort to chat with him. My thinking is that exhibition kind of connected with Viola, who was at that time in a state of grief over Catherine Choi's passing. And I think it gave her a sense of how visual form could convey emotion very directly and very powerfully. Francis Bacon was featured in that show. By that point, both Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning had returned doing figures. And all of that, I think, takes place also during the kind of the McCarthy era of the 1950s, which, I think a lot of people in the art world were being responsive to being kind of unfairly accused of being communist sympathizers. And so there was a sense that, the contemporary American political landscape was also anxiety produced, even though the Korean War had been over for 4 or 5 years. So Vietnam War had not yet started. So therein lies your kind of historical parameter.
So in 1959, Catherine Choi died, who was a personal friend. They had carpooled up from Tulane together, kind of built this clay art center. Viola had bookkeeping acumen. She helped, we found samples of letterhead and the books, if you will, an outline of expenses and income and who was paying what and all that in the Viola Frey archives. So she really helped kind of establish the foundation of the Clay Art Center. So when Catherine Choi died, the personal letters and things like that, we understand she was quite devastated by that. That was a personal friend. She was a mentor. They were exploring, these non-production type clay. And I think she cites at one point the winters were getting to her because there was snow all over the bathroom because someone left the window open. And New Images of Man, people were doing figuration in the Bay Area and elsewhere, but it was not quite being accepted in New York. So she decided to come back.
Well, there's an interesting story there, because what the Seltz exhibition tried to put across was that after, the big question in New York in the late 50s was, okay, Jackson Pollock died. What do we do after Jackson Pollock? What's next after Jackson Pollock? Peter Seltz's exhibition was a candidate to answering that question by suggesting that you would still be dealing with expressionist and existentialist themes in art, but that you would return and use the figure as a a kind of center point for that. Well, as it turned out, the question of what happens after Jackson Pollock was not answered by that exhibition. It was answered by two exhibitions that took place at the Leo Castelli Gallery in 1958, those being solo exhibitions of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, blazing the way for what would soon be, a few years later, be called pop art. So in that sense, the New York art world kind of turned its back on the Seltz exhibition and instead embraced a kind of a realism of signs, which is one way of talking about pop art. I think Viola could have easily at that point detected the writing on the wall and decided that going to San Francisco would be a better deal. I mean, San Francisco was known for the Bay Area figurative movement, for starters. So there was a sense that figurative painters were flourishing in the Bay Area, figurative artists were flourishing in the Bay Area, but not so much in New York after, say, 1960 or after 1959.
When Viola returned to the Bay Area, we've seen in the archives that she kind of keeps painting in one location. She dabbles in ceramics at the studio at CCAC, but they never really come together and start influencing one another until the 70s. Your essay talks about her marking her reputation as an artist began when she had her very own studio. And
Right.
It was difficult for women artists to secure space at that time for artistic practices. But in order to have a studio space to be an artist, which she later identifies with as that's the reason why I am living, is to be an artist, and that's the way I survive, is to be an artist. She shuts out her family and distractions, quote unquote, to focus solely on being an artist. And I wondered if you could talk about some of the dynamics of relationships with her father, her grandmother, and how those might have influenced her work in the Gods and Monsters show.
Well, did the research. There's a lot. You pointed me towards some very useful archival documents, and other essayists also did some research. I'm thinking of Jody Throckmorton's essay for one exhibition, and Garth Clark's essay for another exhibition were also helpful. But essentially, from what I get from reading all the stuff, was that Viola and her father did not have such a great relationship. She characterized him as being friendly to strangers and not so friendly to his own family. He was kind of a third wheel in the early family experience that she grew up in. He kind of was tinkering in the garage, collecting all kinds of things. Certainly the impulse to collect things may come from her father. But the actual winery business in Lodi was run by her grandmother. I think it was her, if I'm not mistaken, it was her maternal grandmother. Am I correct?
Paternal
Grandmother. So her father's mother was probably the domineering influence in that environment, and that her father himself had been kind of relegated to a kind of secondary status. This, I think, he may have, I don't know what, could have happened, but a lot of the work that Viola did later on seems to reflect back on her father, whether we talk about like the kind of the impulse to collect lots and lots of stuff, the impulse to tinker with things. He liked to tinker with radios. I think I read somewhere he had a collection of something like, close to 100 radios, which I guess you could take them out of the Tech Museum and probably turn it into a real collection. But and then there was also this sense of just his kind of emotional absenteeism, which is kind of a clue from someone like myself who perks up when I hear about artist relationships, early relationships with their families, because oftentimes you see in a lot of artists' life stories the idea of an emotionally withdrawn parent. You see that with Van Gogh, you see that with Jackson Pollock, see that with others. And that emotional withdrawal seems to prompt the urge to create displays that would invite a reversal of the withdrawal so that parental attention could be restored. I think she may have fallen into that pattern. I think her father was, and obviously there's a lot that we don't know, but what we also know is that the grandmother taught Viola the rudiments of bookkeeping, which in effect gave Viola a way to make a living, because she and pretty much everybody else knew at the time that Viola was not staying in Lodi any longer than she had to. So at least she could go into the world and do something that she could get paid a decent salary for.
Well, and she paid her bills by bookkeeping until she landed a full-time position at CCAC. So it really was important to her to be able to pay her own bills, support herself, be independent, all of those things. Yeah. And we're running shy on time, but there's one more thing I wanted you to talk about before we move toward questions. And if anyone has a question for us, there's a button at the bottom that says ask a question, and you can put that there. But in the meantime, we had talked earlier today, you and I, Mark, about the figurines and the tchotchkes she collected and their place in her art. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, in my essay, I kind of point to two key art historical influences, the first being the Peter Seltz exhibition, New Images of Man, and oddly enough, a second exhibition that Seltz also curated when he moved to California, called Funk, which was, he was the founding director of the University Art Museum of Berkeley, and he organized this exhibition of mostly sculpture that was going on in the Bay Area, which subsequently brought a lot of national attention, unexpected by many people, I might add. So in the Funk exhibition, you have artists that are doing pretty much everything you could possibly do to create distance between yourself and minimalism. So minimalism, you know, it was kind of like an absolute reversal of everything minimalism stood for. And it was, in my mind, the most important advance of surrealist aesthetics since the early surrealist movement of the 1920s and 30s. Then there's a third influence, which is a little more nebulous, and that comes up in the biographical literature. She was a really nothing short of a fanatic when it came to going to flea markets, particularly the Alameda flea market, which was and still is a vast kind of assortment. And there you start seeing the breakdown of the barrier between fine art and kitsch, which was a theme throughout the 1970s. The idea that fine art was, you know, Clement Greenberg's book, Art and Kitsch, was the "and" was disjunctive, not conjunctive. And so the idea that artists were kind of discovering the surrealist possibilities of kitsch sentimentality was something that was fairly widespread during the 70s, particularly in the feminist art movement. And Viola had a virtual gold mine of material to work with at the Alameda flea market.
She didn't shy away from clutter.
No, she did not. And she was, but the key is not just looking at those kind of kitsch figurines as inspiration, it's how she transformed them to bring out their otherwise concealed pathos. You know, they're supposedly charming reminders of a kind of lost happiness, but then she kind of undermines them a little bit and suggests that they're like, you know, something terrible is lurking behind them. And that is a miniature metaphor for, I think, a large aspect of her overall career.
Great. Did I miss anything on that you wanted to bring up before we pivot to questions?
No, you know, if people are curious, there's always you can actually read my essay, and that should answer a lot of questions.
Look at the pictures in the catalog, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and let's see, I'm just going to read through my notes really quick. So the period of art that we're looking at in the exhibition, some of it's scrolling on the screen here, is from like roughly 1975 to 1980, where she's starting to explore with the figurines she's been collecting, and which sometimes she calls junk sculptures or throwaways, because of that issue that you posed. The kitsch is no longer sentimental anymore. It's being cast out with the garbage. And what do you do with these trinkets? And she turns them into a new meaning. And that's incredibly personal to her. I mean, you even speak with people that have known her over the years, and I've heard interpretations go many different ways. And Viola really intended the viewer to look at them and make their own assumptions. She really didn't divulge much. And one of the questions that I have in front of me was, did Viola ever write about her artwork, or leave journals, or explain what's going on? And I can firmly say, no, she did not. And we rely quite a bit on her housemate and friend, mentor, Charles Fisk, whom I mentioned she met at CCA when she was a student and lived with Viola most of her adult life. And he was an art historian by trade, and really helped kind of help Viola pose these questions, although we entirely believe that the artwork was her own. And he did a lot of reflecting on different periods that she was working on, struggles she was having. And that's actually where Mark and I found some of the information about her turmoil relationship with her family. Was she didn't have time for family. It was taking away from studio time. It was taking away from the artistic practice. Anything that wasn't going into the art or the art community that she made herself a part of, to her was superfluous. And she really did truly breathe and sleep and eat the art that she was making. And we do have quite a large holding of archives from Viola's files. And we also have Charles Fisk's archives. So we're able to kind of reflect back on what was Charles thinking, what was Viola thinking. And they are still being explored. But this exhibition in your essay, Mark, is really the first time that we've had an opportunity to sit down and examine some of those existential questions. What was really going on behind the scenes? Because Viola truly did not talk much about her artwork. Is that your impression?
One quote that's very much my impression. However, once in a while, she let things slip out. There was a feature article in Currents magazine, I forgot the author's name, where she was essentially interviewing Viola, and the writer asked her a question about the large scale of her figures, and asked if she was making some kind of competitive statement with the great tradition of classical sculpture. And Viola said, oh no, that had nothing to do with that. It was what it was like being a little girl on the farm, where the height of the grape plantings kind of established the relationship between near and far, and that to be an adult would be tall enough to look over so it was entirely, the scale of those things was trying to recreate a moment from her childhood, and she's not necessarily competing with the Colossus of Rhodes, although I guess if you make large figurative sculpture, you're always competing with the Colossus of Rhodes. So she was, sometimes she didn't like to make statements, but she did occasionally feel compelled to correct people if she thought they were barking up the wrong tree.
We're going to be bringing in Squeak too to answer additional questions. Mark actually had posed a really good question, which I will say for him to ask when Squeak hops on. But I wanted to circle back really quick, Mark, and ask you about your impressions of this particular checklist, this exhibition, versus what you knew about Viola and her work prior to this exhibition.
Oh, that's a great question. This whole project has a long and circuitous genesis. I think several years ago, Squeak invited me over to show me the photos of some of the earliest work in the Artist Legacy collection, and I think the eye was, what kind of an essay could I write about this? And I was very excited to discover this because, I saw, I touch on this a little bit in my essay, so you can refer back to that. But I saw like the key that could jimmy the lock that opened up the meaning for Viola's entire career. You know, one of the things that people refer to in terms of Viola's late work, they refer to the sculptures as being like cigar store Indians because of their apparent kind of like placid rigidity. I always read that as being more akin to something like frozen anger. There was a sense that like if it didn't freeze, it would explode. And so I felt that there was some kind of explosive undercurrent in those works. And then when I finally saw those early works, I felt like I had, answered that question in the sense that there's like something very raw, very archaic, to use, I think, one of the words I quote in the essay, haptic, about those early works that are kind of directly related to, very directly connected to moments of emotion, of extreme emotion. And then gradually, there's a second phase where she reconciles that haptic quality with other things, and that's the work that comes in the immediate aftermath of the funk period. And then her work gets larger and more complicated and more more self-conscious, for lack of a better word. So that's another kind of phase. So I view this as almost like id, ego, superego, layering of artistic activity. But I think those early things are like amazing little sculptures. They're also quite frightening to most people. I kind of like scary art, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about that.
Well, I was telling you, Mark, earlier when I was reviewing the slides of those photographs that she took, there was several that I just had to put to the side and just, think about for a while because I didn't know where to put them, in what I knew about Viola Frey. And so it's been a fun project to dig with you and kind of explore these ideas and find out what was really going on.
Yeah, it was like an archaeological dig in some ways. So we had to like go down and then find a layer below the layer that we just discussed. I like doing those kind of projects. They're really I think they yield a lot of worthwhile insight.
Yeah.
Squeak, so Mark had asked a question of me earlier that I couldn't answer, and I'm hoping that you could help me. Yeah. And so we know a lot that that Viola and Charles had relied a lot on each other. And after Charles passed away, Mark was curious if Viola went through a period of reflection and similar to maybe after when she lost her friend Catherine Choi. Did you see a change in the artwork she was producing after Charles passed away?
No. She sort of just carried on.
It was familiar to her.
I didn't know her right after, at the time when Catherine Choi died. I think, and from everything I've heard, it was really traumatic. So I don't think she ever wanted to experience that trauma ever again. She was very careful about those kinds of feelings being public in any way, even with people she knew well. Charles.
Well, there's also.
Go ahead.
There's also a difference. Catherine Choi died rather surprisingly and rather suddenly. Charles was sick for a long time, so
he was allowed.
And then finally, Viola was very young when Catherine Choi died, and young people have a harder time processing trauma than older people do because older people are going to get used to it.
Yeah, they're further away from the end. Yeah, and but I know she missed him. I think it was hard, but Sam, her studio assistant, was really helpful. She had a lot of people around her that remained. So, I think that
community that she cared about and cared about her, and so she was able to keep moving on and producing art. Till she was passed away.
Yeah.
Maybe you can answer this, Squeak. How does Viola Frey's work influence that of her students and successive generation of artists? Do you see any influences there? Is that a loaded question? Do you pass?
It's just, like that's like a. Mark, you want to answer that? It's like
well,
so
it's
broad.
interesting.
Yeah.
I guess the question that I would rephrase the question as saying, rather than just influenced artists, influenced students specifically who worked with her. Obviously, like Ruby Neri, who actually studied with me at SFAI, later claimed that Viola's work was a tremendous influence on her work, and all you need to do is look at it as how and why. But she was not a student of Viola's. She was an onlooker from a slightly different distant shore. And
like Kathy Butterly, for instance, does very
cool.
small, very delicate, beautiful pieces, and they're nothing like Viola's, but she was very influenced by Viola when Viola came to
Purdue.
No, not Purdue, the Philadelphia women's.
That's right. Moore College.
Yeah.
College. That's right.
Yeah. So Viola came there and did a talk, and they had a show also of Viola's work at the same time. And Kathy and Viola were about the same size, same height. And when Kathy saw the work and saw Viola, she went, "Oh, well, I don't want to be a painter. I want to do this," So she changed her major. Yeah.
It's that ability to see someone similar to you, or that you could align yourself with, to say, "Oh, they're doing it, so why can't I?"
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And she encouraged experimentation and, taking risks and doing whatever you wanted to do, really. I don't have a good example of.
Not a problem. I know I had a hard time pulling additional names out of my head, but it's something we're always looking into.
Okay.
Another question that came in for both of you, considering what she's well known for, how does the Gods and Monsters show differ? And I think, Mark, you may have touched on this a little bit, but how does this show differ from ones that have happened in the past for Viola Frey?
Well, this one has a much larger percentage of works from that early period that has been kind of papered over
exactly
Viola's career. And so this is kind of like, again, looking behind the surface to see what's behind the latter work. So I think the term that the work is more archaic. The emotion behind it is much rawer. She's not making, shall we say, annotative comments about the state of the American family, because she's not thinking in those broader terms. I think these early things are really powerful. They almost get to the point where you can't even talk about them as art. You have to talk about them as ritual artifacts from like lost civilizations or something. They look like something that belongs in an archaeology museum.
Yeah.
And that's what I really like about them.
And a lot of the later work, the color blocks the emotion in a way. It doesn't make it as accessible. Like Viola did.
Sugarcoat. I would say sugarcoat.
It does, actually. And they're beautiful, but she did a family portrait thing that was sort of one of these, a guy in overalls, a father, mother, and a bunch of people and a bunch of objects and stuff. And it was shown all white, and it was heartbreakingly beautiful and so powerful. And it didn't sell, and it went back to the studio, and she painted it. And it's beautiful. It's fabulous. But there was something about it when it was just all this really milky white glaze. It was gorgeous, and it had an accessibility, a way into the emotions that was it was more accessible in that way. Yeah. I think that's the show you reviewed. Maybe not.
I think I did review that. I did review early on a show at Rena Branston.
Yeah.
And then I did see the show of the Crocker Art Museum show that when it came to Oakland, because actually I was still living in Oakland the first time. That was before I moved to Bolinas.
Yeah.
Now I'm back in Oakland. Can't get too far away from home. And so that was also useful. And also, as I recall, it was Garth Clark's essay for that show was like the first like major art historical treatment of Viola's work. Certainly little like notices and whatnots, but that was the first attempt at a comprehensive analysis.
Yeah, and he came and stayed with Viola and Charles fed him all kinds of material, you know, from Levi-Strauss to a whole bunch, you know, bricoleur, all that stuff. So, because there was something going around CCAC at the time. Dennis Leon was teaching it in sculpture, and so it was. So Charles, because he was sort of the Boswell, the observer of Viola's work, and would write things just for his own pleasure to write about what he thought about Viola's work, gave that. Well, he helped Garth in order to see what he, you know, to give him more information, and that's a fabulous essay that Garth did too. It's one of the best. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and like Mark pointed out, that was her first retrospective. She was in her 40s, first real museum essay exhibition to put her on the map, and people were just blown away by it. And so that was in 81, started at the Crocker and traveled kind of regionally. And then in 1984, she had a much smaller show at the Whitney Museum with an essay by Patterson Sims. And that's when the East Coast really kind of found out about her.
And prior to the Crocker show, Viola, and right before she started showing with Rena Branston, she spent 5 years not showing in galleries at all. And
that's
just
right.
Sort of figuring out what she wanted to do. And that was when she made the transition from the smaller work to the larger figures. And yeah, and moved to Oakland and had the studio in the backyard and everything. Yeah.
See, and I don't have any more questions coming in. Was there something that you guys want to address before we pivot? Any questions from the audience? You can put it in the chat comments or the ask a question section.
I don't see any questions on the
Sidebar. Yeah.
If you think of questions later on down the road, you can email the foundation, Artist Legacy Foundation. .org is the website. We also have violafrey.org as Viola's website. We manage both of those websites. You can also see what we're putting on Instagram at Viola Frey Archives. We're pulling directly from the archives, and it's meant to be less static than a website. And we're always looking for questions to come in to help us think about other perspectives we haven't already explored or other scholars haven't explored. And we also encourage researchers to come to Oakland and meet with us. So if that's all we've got, I'll wait for Jack to probably move me off and say a few closing comments.
There he goes.
There he goes. And I want to thank American University Museum for working with us through this whole process, producing a beautiful catalog and this event, and including us to a national audience. It's pretty fantastic. This is our first ever, and I think we were able to get online okay. And I really want to thank you, Jack, for hosting us.
Well, I want to thank the panel. What a great panel, and all the participants tonight. If you're interested in what we do here at American University, you can go to our website, american.edu/museum, and go to the Museum at Home part of the website. If you're interested in the Artist Legacy Foundation, you should be. It's a great organization. It's really a model for artist-funded foundations in the country. And you can find out lots about it and Viola Frey. If you go to, the email is info@Artist Legacy Foundation, one word, artistlegacyfoundation.org. Check it out. Thank you all, and good night.